amazing crowd. Wait to hear what I have to say. We are most certainly at the most unlikely time in American politics. We have come, in my opinion, to a period where 30 years of domination by a two-party duopoly elite who endeavor, very hard to sound different on the major issues facing the country, but who, at the end of the day, sadly, are identical. And it's difficult for me to say this because I have great sentimental attachment to the Republican Party. I was a young Republican national chairman, but I was attracted to the Republican Party because of Barry Goldwater's message of smaller government, keeping the government out of your business and out of your personal life, peace through strength, having a muscular national defense as opposed to going around the globe looking for trouble, starting wars, fiscal integrity where you didn't borrow and you couldn't pay back, where taxes were low. This was a kind of the Republican Party that attracted me, and then ultimately I figured out that the Republican Party, with the nomination of poor dumb Mitt Romney, had morphed into a carbon copy of the Democratic Party. And the Bushes and the Clintons working together have given us endless war, erosion of our civil liberties, massive debt and spending and borrowing, an immigration system by any definition which is broken, trade agreements that were sold to us as the panacea, which have literally ripped the jobs out of this country and exported them. And then lastly, a foreign policy. This just doesn't seem to make any sense based on who your friends are and who your enemies are. We seem to have systematically gone out of the way to embolden and strengthen our enemies while constantly undercutting our traditional allies. You would think it was an accident if it wasn't done on purpose. And then we reached a point, which in my view became a tipping point in American politics, where in the 40 years that I've been studying sophisticated polling data to try to determine the voters were thinking and at what was motivating them. And I must tell you that by 2016, I had never seen an electorate in a more sour, angry, distrustful, disillusioned position. Here's what was different than before. Not only did voters no longer trust both political parties, the Congress, the political institutions, but for the first time, they didn't trust big media either. They finally figured out that big media just repeats the lies of big government, and that media, who we like to think are unbiased and only interested in the truth, are corporately owned and have agendas of their own. And that, coupled with a very significant technological advance, set the stage for the election of Donald Trump. When, in the early days, mainstream media consisted just of 3 television networks and 2 or 3 national newspapers. National by reputation, not necessarily distribution. Then they had a monopoly on political discourse. All 3 networks said the Harvey Oswald killed John Kennedy, then it was so, because nobody else was saying otherwise. But and later on, with the development of 2 major cable networks, the kind of elitist establishment view still is not severely challenged. But when we have the rise of the internet and that people's viewing habits changed. People no longer now getting their news from a television in the kitchen or in the living room, but now getting it on their handheld device or on their iPad or on their computer, and they have to pass through the internet to watch television. It doesn't take too long to find out that, yes, I'm sorry, but Infowars.com is more credible than CNN. I'm happy to argue it. The point being, you find diversity. If you don't like what you find, you can find something else. So it gives rise to a vibrant, robust alternative media, both left and right and center. So now the three networks are not the only voice, and that there are alternative choices for viewers. That, I think, is a positive development for the democracy of the small d, which is why I'm deeply concerned now to see the tech left giants, Amazon, Yahoo, Twitter, Facebook, and particularly Google, trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube. Manipulating their algorithms, so maybe Roger Stone's tweets don't get as wide a distribution as they used to get, or setting themselves as arbiters for what is fake news. In fact, folks, it's even worse than that. President Obama signed an appropriation attached to a defense appropriation that set up a truth board, and they, the government, shall decide what is true and what can be said and what cannot. If that doesn't violate the First Amendment, I don't know what does. But you're going to get a little box that pops up and says this is fake news if someone disagrees with what you say. Censorship, I don't care if you're right, left, center, I don't care where you are on the spectrum or how radical. You should have a voice. Nobody should tamper with your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed or your ability to express yourself. That is fundamentally un-American. I'm a conservative, but I'm fundamentally a First Amendment guy. I've got a lot of crazy opinions, and I feel strongly about my right to express them. And so should you. This, to me, is the slippery slope. In other words, when in politics we can no longer debate any issue on the merits, and the solution of one side is to just censor the other side, that to me is scary. But I think it brought us to a point that allowed for the election of an improbable president. Why were the polls wrong? This is not some big malicious conspiracy. It really isn't. There are some survey researchers who are more partisan than others who might load up the Democratic sample within a survey by a couple points to try to enhance. But most pollsters are honest practitioners, and they just would like to be accurate because that's what's good for their business. The problem is that most of them were basing their assumption on a turnout that was identical to the turnout 4 years previously. And that just never made sense. I mean, there's no reason to believe, for example, that an equal number of African Americans would come out for Barack Obama that would come out for Hillary Clinton. But we were still basing our base assumptions on an electorate that they think they very badly misread. Here's what they misread. Turnout in rural areas was up sharply. Turnout in urban areas was down sharply. Turnout among African Americans was down. Turnout among Hispanics was about the same, substantial. And everything else pretty much remained the same. They did not count on Trump beating Hillary among white women by 54 points. So you had a different electorate than those that showed up. You could see by following the state polling 10 days out in watching the polls in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that the late momentum was to Trump. Mrs. Clinton, I think, made an egregious mistake by essentially resting the last 10 days and Trump, whatever else he may be, is a closer, getting 2 or 3 hours sleep a night, hitting Democratic strong-willed polls in Milwaukee and Detroit and Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Cleveland, and then starting all over again. It reminded me very much, I wrote this in one of my books, about the race. Well, put it this way. I would have to say the election of Donald Trump was the greatest single upset to date in American political history. And prior to this, I guess 1948 would be considered the great upset, where everybody knew that all the polls showed Governor Tom Dewey was a lock. Harry Truman, his poll numbers were terrible. The left wing of his party walked out on him and went for Henry Wallace. The right wing of his party walked out on him and went for Strom Thurmond, who seems to have lived to be 200. And Truman just refused to accept that result. And he started a train trip in the East, traveling west. This is where the whistle stop tour comes from. And both in large cities and small, he would stop. People would have been told in advance by an engaged team in flyers that the President of the United States would be in town. And as he moved west, his crowds got bigger and bigger and bigger. And as they got bigger, Harry got nastier and nastier. The Republicans are sticking a pitchfork in the back of every farmer in America. Pretty tough stuff. By the time Truman got to California, where Dewey had nothing to worry about because Governor Earl Warren, the popular governor of California, was his running mate, the crowds were gigantic. And of course, Truman narrowly carried California in the election. And through this tour, I read that Harry was riding in the cab of a locomotive, exhorting the engineers to go faster so that he could get to more towns and make more speeches. Which reminded me of Trump saying, "What do you mean you guys can't fly again? Get 3 new pilots in here. We gotta go. We gotta go." I mean, really kind of extorting his team. So, as you know, as a pilot, you can only fly a certain number of times before you have to rest. Trump was burning out teams of pilots and getting a couple hours of sleep on the plane. And then it occurred to me that in a way, Hillary Clinton was actually a lot like Tom Dewey, in the sense that they were both overconfident, somewhat aloof. While Harry Truman was closing, Tom Dewey was at the Roosevelt Hotel in his suite, probably in his velvet smoking jacket, holding a cigarette holder and picking out his cabinet. And where was Hillary while she was losing? Well, she was in Chappaqua, in her pajamas, looking at swatches for the material on the Oval Office curtains. Physical effort matters in these things. The closing momentum matters. There's just no question that Donald Trump, who I've known for 40 years, outworked his opponent and made calculations that I must tell you, some of which I certainly disagree with. His entire campaign was built solely on a communications-based strategy built around these centerpiece rallies, essentially betting that the cable networks would broadcast the rallies wall to wall, which they did, worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Did you see many John Kasich rallies wall to wall on CNN or Fox? So it became symbiotic. The rallies boosted Fox's ratings, and Fox was in essence, or CNN, boosting Donald Trump's ratings. And therefore, the notion that you would need to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on paid broadcast television to fend off the millions of dollars being spent offensively against you turns out largely to be wrong. You could fight paid television with free television, and then you couple it with a work ethic in which, in this period at least, If two kids with a webcast from Weehawken, New Jersey asked Trump for an interview, the answer was yes. I mean, he would do every interview he could smash into a day in order to utterly dominate, the free media dialogue, something that he's exceedingly good at. So, if somebody will advise me on time, I do want to leave time for questions.
We have half an hour.
All right. So why don't we go to questions because they're more fun anyway. I'm happy to take any of the questions. Yes?
How do we explain that 54% or 53% of white women voted for Trump, despite the fact that he did nasty things against women? How do you explain that?
Well, I think a lot of those women found out that Bill Clinton had been no angel himself, but that Hillary was the one who hired the heavy-handed private detectives, the nasty lawyers to threaten those victims. If you read my book, The Clinton's War on Women, I document this pretty thoroughly, although the guy who really documents it is David Brock in his book, The Education of Hillary Rodham. So that information was largely suppressed in the 80s. When I spoke of the three-network monopoly on political information, only one of them was willing to interview Juanita Broaddrick, a woman who I think quite credibly claimed Bill Clinton not only raped but bit her upper lip. And they held that broadcast for 6 months before they finally aired it. The other two networks had no interest. And then in a more recent interview, Ms. Broaddrick says that in the interview, when she began to talk about being threatened by Hillary to her face, the producer just cut her off and said, "We're not interested in that." So, when you get back into the political wars, 20 years after your heyday, everything's fair game. Just because you think something was adjudicated 20 years ago, not necessarily so. The public record is the public record. Trump had to face the things that were in his public record, some of them damn it. So did the Clintons. Yes.
Good morning, afternoon. I am also a former Republican, switched to Libertarian Party, big pro-Trump supporter, which gets me vilified within Mensa quite a bit. My question to you, I also went to high school with Paul Corbin Jones, so grew up under the Clinton era, knew about some of what was going on. The problem is that when I tried to speak to my peers about politics, what I find is that even among Mensans, no one's interested in primary sources. How do you overcome the media boondoggle and the propaganda machine that it's become with primary source information?
Well, the best way, of course, is to have a completely free and open net where nothing is censored. Otherwise, you'll never find the information that you're looking for. Let me give you an example. Russell Baker, a very fine writer-researcher, wrote a book on the Bush family. One of the things he learned was that Prescott Bush, who was George H.W. Bush's father, later a partner at Brown & Brothers Harriman, owned a bank in New York which was seized by the federal government because it was being used to arm the Third Reich, to finance the armament of the Nazi war machine. And Baker found these records deep within the Treasury Department to document the facts. And he published his book, and shortly thereafter, the original documents disappeared. Now, it's a perfect example of manipulation of the system. He kept actual photographs and copies. It's now been re-reported by a number of authors. It's in my book on the Bush crime families, I call them. It speaks to the concerns that you have. But, again, censorship would only make things, in my opinion, worse. Another question.
Any comments on the future under the Trump administration? I mean, we've done this radical change. We have somebody who came in and said, I'm going to make a radical change, but there are some questions about his abilities, and so far as for several months in office, he's done things that some of us seem as not very intelligent. Some of us. I'm trying to get an argument here.
turning an ocean liner that's been headed in the same direction for 30 years around takes some time. He also comes to it with a giant disadvantage in that being not part of the system. Look at it this way. Richard Nixon sat there for 8 years and watched Eisenhower, and therefore he knew how the government worked. Lyndon Johnson had been in the Senate and the House, had been John Kennedy. He knew how the government worked. They knew the top 10 most important jobs in government, then the next 10, and the next 10, and so on. And they all hit the ground running in terms of appointments. Because he's not part of the system, he I don't think, came to the job with an understanding of that, nor perhaps how the Washington rumor mill and media cycle work, which can be a vicious thing. I think despite a mountain of criticism, he's gotten some very significant things done that appeal to his base. As I think most people know, I have one very specific concern, because the president absolutely made it clear that he supported states' rights in the 29 states that chose to legalize some form of marijuana. You can't be for states' rights for transgender bathrooms and gay marriage and abortion, and then say, oh, wait a minute, on marijuana I have a different position. Now suddenly, the Attorney General and the Homeland Security Secretary, John Kelly, egged on by Chris Christie, are advocating a new war on drugs. Folks, when are we going to learn the federal experience of the war on drugs is an abject, expensive, ignominious, racist failure? It didn't work. It's not working. How did you go back to it? I think this is something where I'd have to praise the Obama administration. When the people in 29 states, in many cases by overwhelming margins, legalized medicinal marijuana in their states that contradicted federal law, Eric Holder put out a memo, basically said we're going to stand down in these states where there's a conflict. That was good public policy. First of all, people who are sick could get their medicine. It is floating the finances of half the states in the country. Without it, Colorado and California are bankrupt, and so are most of their large counties. It's creating thousands of jobs. Unlike the Israelis, we have no really good research into the potential benefits of cannabis. They've done an incredible job, and there are additional medicinal benefits that we don't even fathom yet. So I am working with a coalition of Republicans and Democrats, progressives and libertarians, across the board to convince the president to do two things. Keep your pledge, keep the Holder memo in place, and support the state's rights to choose medicinal marijuana. And secondarily, move marijuana off the Schedule 1 of drugs so that doctors can prescribe it for patients who get it. So I'm sorry, I'm passionate about this subject, so I kind of got into a cul-de-sac.
The Democrats do not seem to have a deep bench. What problems are they going to face in the next presidential sequence of putting somebody up that has national appeal? Are there any Democrats in the wings, in your view, that could fill that bill?
It is a difficult question because at this point the positionings of the Democratic Party make their coalition relatively narrow. And while they have some skilled and capable people in their party, it's hard to see the rationale for their candidacy. So, for example, Governor Andrew Cuomo will be a 3-term governor of the largest state in the country, yet there are no jobs in New York. Taxes are destroying their economy, and there's been no real approval. You have to have something to sell to voters. I'm baffled by the subject. You want to know the truth? the Democrats' strongest candidate would be Michelle Obama. Barack Obama is still revered by the majority of this country. There are many Democrats who don't care for the Clintons who love Barack Obama. I think it's one of the reasons why he beat her so handily. She certainly has the capability, if she chose, to develop more of that side of her public image. I think she's a brilliant woman. I don't think she'd be a bad candidate. And in case you didn't know this, her husband still controls the machinery of the Democratic Party. So there's a candidate with instantaneous name ID that would have a built-in constituency and the ability to raise money. You look at governors, you look at senators. I mean, Terry McAuliffe would steal a hot stove. I mean, you got to have somebody who can stand up to the scrutiny, who has the size. I don't mean the physical size, but the command presence, the charisma, the magnetism, and then lastly, they have to have a core message. I'm sorry, but I don't understand a Democratic Party, the Democratic Party of Harry Truman and John Kennedy, that will not stand up against Islamic terrorism when it comes to the oppression of gay people, for example. I don't understand that. It baffles me. So I think their coalition is falling apart. On the other hand, this is no day at the beach for Donald Trump either. He's got an establishment party who realizes his nomination was a hostile takeover, and they can't wait for him to get out of town. You see them undermining him in the Congress, all the while going on TV and talking about how strongly they support him. So this is going to be an interesting 4 years, but I would just caution anybody, and you heard this at the end of 100 days, you won't know whether this is successful or a failure until the end of it. Andrew Jackson, a vulgarian, a madman, a lunatic, violent, vulgar, ignorant, one of our greatest presidents. Theodore Roosevelt, an egomaniac, a liar, a self-promoter, a gadfly, a lightweight, another one of our greatest presidents. You won't be able to know how Barack Obama or Bill Clinton or Donald Trump have done until 20 years from now, and then you'll begin to know. Look, I take a beating for this, but say anything you like. Richard Nixon ended the war in Vietnam faster than the Pentagon wanted. He opened the door to China around the backs of his own NSC structure in the Pentagon. He negotiated a nuclear arms limitation with the Russians. He saved Israel unilaterally from destruction in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Over the objection of Kissinger, over the objection of the Joint Chiefs, he airlifts $137 million in lethal aid to Golda Meir, and Israel's back is against the city. He desegregated the public schools. He gave us desegregation of the building trades unions. He launched the Environmental Protection Agency. He set up the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. And yes, he gave us affirmative action. That's a record. Sorry, but that's a record. Richard Nixon. Anyway. And he made egregious mistakes. The war on drugs, as we discussed. Closing the gold window. We could go on and on about Watergate. All I'm saying is that the further you get away, the better you can see the totalitarian. And in this case, it is. Nixon was a progressive president when it came to domestic policy. My conservative friends would choke when I say that.
Many of us are glad that you appear to break with the administration about their renewing the war on drugs. I'm also curious about net neutrality because it seems to be going utterly counter to what the FCC is doing under Trump. Seems to be utterly counter to what you're advocating in terms of having an open net.
Actually, I don't agree with that. We have a juxtaposition of the rhetoric here. The open net people are actually for censorship. They have grabbed our rhetoric. I think what Adjunct Pi is doing will preserve a free internet. I have a long piece on this that hopefully I will finish this weekend, and I'm going to the FCC hearings. This is very interesting. It's a classic Alinsky tactic, I think, to call yourself something you're really not. I'm not completely happy because, in all honesty, I'd have the Justice Department on Google for antitrust if I were the Attorney General, if I were the President. I don't think they've been aggressive enough, but it's a long discussion. I'd like to have it if you want to see me afterwards. Yep.
If Trump had not won the election, which of the other declared Republican candidates would you think would have been best?
God, that's a none of the above question. My problem is I know all of them. I know every one of them. And there's just not a president there. There's some good governors there, but I just don't see a president there. Yeah, I'm going to take a dive on that.
As someone who's known the president for decades, what insight do you have into his becoming the champion of working class people as they saw it, as he saw it? From his position, of course, as a very wealthy businessman.
Well, of course, this is not atypical. While Donald Trump is certainly not the aristocrat that Franklin Roosevelt was, Roosevelt was revered by the working people because he fought for them, not because he was one of them. Trump is closer to one of them. Yeah, he has a Wharton education. He's got a great Ivy League education. The family has made a lot of money. But he still, and this is a positive, talks like a guy from Queens. And therefore he can communicate to people in a way that they can understand. And I think they had come to see career politicians who were reading off of polling or focus groups or roundtables or reading a speech of a 25-year-old speechwriter as phony, as not genuine. And the fact that Trump would make an occasional mistake or things wouldn't come out exactly the way he wanted them to, that imperfection kind of showed that he was authentic, that he wasn't one of these confections of political spinmeisters. And he correctly hit it right on the head. He just got to a point where they began to believe that election time, candidates of both parties promise us everything and deliver nothing. I mean, in many ways, Trump's election was aided by the fact that the idea of hope and change, I think, elated most Americans who were waiting for it, and then they believed it just never came, at least not for them. And it just added to another level of disillusionment. Whether you can now, in this divided political electorate, whether you can forge consensus and get some of the fundamental things that he has said he wants to get done, all of that will determine his ability to be reelected. Meaning, had I been in his shoes, I think I would have done all of my economic reforms first, my tax reforms first, things that were designed to try to spur the economy. Growing the economy buys a lot of political capital and it buys you time to do other things. I think putting the travel ban first and not second was probably, at least technically, an error. And the pressure on Republicans in the House and Senate to be with Trump on tax matters, which is kind of a doctrinaire position for Republicans, is going to be very great. There's a greater chance, I think, of holding that together.
Where do you see healthcare going?
Damned if I know. I mean, I'm trying to figure it out.
My question has to do with the fact that all our domestic ports have been leased to foreign, perhaps adversarial governments, and that any radiation detection is being done by Pakistan. And do you see him doing anything toward regulating any of this, or the movement of uranium, or all these domestic pouches that have now become cargo ships coming into our ports? It's causing us extreme danger. Do you see anything happening there?
I acknowledge the problem. I'm certain that you're aware of it, but in a certain sense, I think when you become president, you have to feel, as Terry Truman said, the guy who had a bale of hay locked up. I mean, he has so many imperatives, he has so many crises. I saw him briefly after his very first national security briefing, and he was just white as a ghost and said, I just heard things that I can't tell you that you just wouldn't believe, that are just incredible. So it is a problem, particularly the Chinese acquisitions. I just read a piece on that. The drones being flown in this country are 80% produced in China. If they can get a couple of words passed legislatively, it'll be 100% short bill. So it's a legitimate issue, in my view. Yes, sir. All right, we're going to you and then this gentleman over here.
I'd like to know if you agree that unless circumstances change greatly, there are going to be a lot of people running for president in the next election in both parties. And you'll see other celebrities saying, I never thought of myself as being possible president of the United States. Now that's changed to be possible candidates on the left side, like George Clooney or Oprah Winfrey. You may laugh at these, but there's no reason to do that.
No, I saw Penn Jillette before this. I told him he should run. I will manage his campaign.
The bar has been lowered, and there's going to be a lot of candidates.
Well, I guess I would say two things. We are now to a point, though, where there's an intersection of pop culture and politics, or I should say politics and entertainment, and therefore the greatest single asset that a person can have in running for president is being well known, just being well known. This is one of Trump's greatest assets. With 15 seasons of The Apprentice, where the production value is extraordinary. Go back and look. He's in the high back chair. Every hair is perfectly in place. He's perfectly been made up. He looks like the chief executive. In fact, he looks like the president. So he begins the race with 100% name idea. Everybody knows who Donald Trump is. Marco Rubio, not so much. So it is, this is not the first time we've seen it, but you've seen this more abroad than here, where entertainers have run for office. The boxer, for example, who ran in the Philippines, Pacquiao. But at the same time, it's too early to say whether you're going to have a big field, because in politics, a year is a lifetime. And now, with internet-based media and the thousands of choices and the fast-moving pace of events and the unending news cycle, that's even truer than it used to be, and therefore it's impossible to say. Politicians also like open seats. They don't generally like to challenge incumbents because, generally speaking, most incumbents, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, everybody but poor George Bush, get reelected. Father of this. So it's just too early to say. One thing I learned is not to make broad prognostications about politics for something that even happens a year from now, never mind 3.
Penn Jillette's answer to that question was he has a job, and he thinks that politics is for people who don't have jobs.
10 minutes, please.
A somewhat minor issue, but very important to me, is in the realm of separation of church and state.
Yes.
The president has made comments about the Johnson principle. He's, I think, catered to the religious conservatives who supported him during the campaign. But
Lyndon had to shut those preachers down in Texas, so we're talking about
I
it.
understand that. And setting aside the unequal treatment or enforcement of the principle, would you have advice for the president in that realm?
You're right about him having a fixation on it. It's interesting because I don't know how he learned about this and so on. I guess what I'd like to see is the equal administration of the law and the regulations by the IRS across the board of everybody, left and right. The Clinton Foundation is not a charity; it's a slush fund for grifters. It was a vehicle for the facilitation of multi-million-dollar bribes. Why do they still have their tax status? They violate again and again and again. Their filings are incomplete. If anybody right-of center did that, they would have had their certificate pulled. And if a church is engaging in politics, whether it's a Unitarian church or an evangelical Christian church, that's against the law. You're right, it's not equally administered, it's administered at all. The ministers feel very strongly about it, and I gather they feel their filings or their books are being examined. Actually, it's not a subject I've ever discussed with the president's side. I don't know where his deep-seated views on this come from. Overall, I'm probably for repeal, but I'm kind of, I wrote a book on Lyndon Johnson, and I'm very steeped in why the law comes, so I'm probably too biased to give a reasonable opinion.
Roger, I want to thank you for coming. First of all, it's great. During the election, there was no question. The media kind of thought Donald Trump was fun, and they really played into his hand, as you said earlier, and they followed all of his campaign. Now he's won. Every day it's 24/7, appears on CNN or MSNBC, trash Trump, constant. How's he going to overcome this? I know he loves Twitter and use social media, but how's he going to overcome it for this next election cycle?
Well, I'd actually argue that the cycle is a little different than he described. It's very interesting. Hamilton Gerber, who was Jimmy Carter's chief of staff, wrote a biography that I read. It's a pretty good book about his time in the White House and so on. And he said in the book that in 1979 and 80, Carter desperately wanted to run against Ronald Reagan because he thought he would be easy to beat. The Clintons looked at the Republican field and they wanted Donald Trump. It would be easy to beat him. He's a buffoon, he's a clown, nobody takes him seriously, and so on. I would argue that particularly the cable news networks went out of their way to build Trump in the nomination process. They gave him the best press he could possibly, best coverage he could possibly have. Then, as the convention turned, you would see a turn in their coverage. For those who think that this is entirely ideological, I would argue that a lot of this has to do with profit. This is our market. Let's get the liberal, left of center, anti-Trump viewer to be our viewer. Buy the products advertised on our network. So I think some of it is just strategic marketing. The good news is less than 50% are now getting their news from the news outlets that you just named that you're concerned about. And if we can have a free open net, that number will continue to drop. My prediction, network news will be a thing of the past in 5 years because it's pegged to the idea that you rush home at 7 to watch your favorite program. But now you can watch it later having recorded it, so why would you rush home? You're not fixed to the time of their schedule other than, I think, maybe an occasional special or something that's held. The network television will go the way of the buggy whip. Cable will end up going the same way. The massification of media will be through the internet because it's so much less expensive. You don't need this cable network, which costs hundreds of millions of dollars, to put a well-produced television show up on the internet where people can access it. That's the business model way to the future, I think. Yes?
Trump promised the working class that he is going to be protecting their interests, but the health care proposal and the proposed budget, 23 million people are likely to be without that coverage, and in the process he's giving tax breaks to millionaires. How is he keeping his promises to his supporters?
First of all, in both those cases, since we don't have either a final tax bill or a final health care bill, I'm not sure we know where it's going to end up. I'm one who says you should cut the corporate tax rate. If you cut the corporate tax rate in the United States below that of Canada, Mexico, Japan, and China, all those U.S. companies doing business there because it's cheaper will do business here, expand higher here. It's kind of a no-brainer. The The Democrats will say, cutting taxes on corporations. Well, corporations produce jobs. That's where jobs come from. So I guess I would say to you that there are going to be many cross pressures on Trump, from the political establishment, from his supporters, from the party, from the other party. And this is, in my view, very much a work in progress. I worked for Richard Nixon, I worked for Ronald Reagan, and I worked for Donald Trump. Nixon was a pragmatist. He was interested in what works. Let's try something that works. Reagan was an ideologue. He believed in a more strict philosophical framework of what he wanted to do. Donald Trump is more like Nixon than Reagan in the sense that he's not an ideologue. He's really a populist, and he's interested in progress. He also, I think, as he's told us a million times, he's a deal maker. He'd rather have half a loaf than no loaf. I would like to see him get down to the Congress, get his hands dirty, call some meetings, lock the doors, and nobody leaves till we have a deal on health care. Lyndon Johnson did it. It can be done. Trump is the greatest negotiator I've ever seen. I negotiated 7 compensation contracts with him. In the last 30 years, he took me to the cleaners in every one.
Do you see an end to the Bush dynasty? And also, is Hillary done at this point?
My book on the Bush family, which is entitled The Bush Crime Family, is now available at Barnes & Noble, and I trace the family's wealth to the financing of the Nazi war machine by Prescott Bush, later the U.S. Senator from Connecticut. I trace George H.W. Bush's role as the director of the CIA, trafficking millions of dollars of cocaine into the United States to illegally finance the Nicaraguan Contra rebels after the Congress cut off the financing. I think you find the chapters about the attempted Reagan assassination fascinating. And then, yes, Jeb got a $4 million federal government bailout on a building in Miami when he was about to lose $4 million. Would that have happened for you and I? I don't think so. So I think that they have worn out their welcome. What was interesting to me was a widespread belief in the Republican Party, and I would have to admit the brilliance of this. The Bush's domination of the party during their heyday was total, and they would say endlessly, George W. kept us safe. Wait a minute. The attack on 9/11 happens during his presidency. Therefore, how do you argue this? Or, the one that's even worse, yes, going into Iraq was the right thing to do. Jeb was still trying to defend that early in the campaign. It was believed that that orthodoxy would hold together within the Republican Party, and Trump exploded it. Iraq, bad idea. 9/11, I got a lot of questions about that. Who are these guys training in North Florida? And why didn't anybody pay attention to that? That's where that debate was going. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement had 22 individual complaints about several of the hijackers in Sarasota training at a flight school there. No one ever told the federal government. So I think that the Bushes are done. George P. Bush, the Texas Railroad Commissioner, aspires to be president, but if I live long enough, I'll make sure that doesn't happen too.
Last question, please.
And as far as Hillary is concerned, I really, look, I think Bill and Hillary Clinton are skilled politicians. They are talented, smart people. They have dodged so many bullets. He's had such a tumultuous career in presidency. This is, after all, a man who was impeached but not convicted. Why they did not just ride off into the sunset with their hundreds of millions of dollars and be happy, I don't know. But by getting back into the arena, everything's back on the table. I could not see her mounting another campaign. It would be 3. I really don't believe she has the stamina to do it. I also think the Democratic Party, having given her a free shot, would really not be happy with it. So yeah, I think both dynasties are done. with this caveat, and that is, it's possible that Chelsea Clinton could move to a congressional district outside New York City and run for Congress, but I don't know, I think Donnie Jr. lives in that district. Anyway. Yes.
Two questions. First, the geek question. The LA Times poll in the weeks leading up to the election showed consistently different numbers than most of the other major polls. And they were pretty close, as it turns out, to the election. So, first question is, what are your thoughts about that, if any?
Well, I mean, somebody doing survey research for the LA Times had a different model of what was going to turn out. And therefore, their model was closer to the reality of turnout, which is why their numbers came out. I think if you went to the crosstabs and looked at their Republican, Democrat, rural, urban, so you'd have to look at every demographic range, but somebody made a better projection as to who was going to turn out. That's what determines the accuracy of the poll.
The second question. You, as will be no surprise for you to hear from me, have become something of a lightning rod. People love you, they hate you, and everything in between. In terms of the work that you do, is this an asset or liability?
The only thing worse in politics than being wrong is being boring, and I try never to be boring. The only thing that's worse than being talked about is not being talked about. And it is better to be infamous than to have never been famous at all.
We have time for one more.
Now, while we're at it, I might as well tell you my 3 rules. They're simple, and I think they will serve you well. Lay low, play dumb, and keep moving. And then there's the 3 corollaries. Admit nothing, deny everything, launch counterattack. Anyway, I stole most of them from Sunday School. Yes?
How do you see the Russia investigation playing out, and do you think there's anybody in trouble?
So far, this appears to me to be a scandal without any evidence. I mean, I'm testifying on July 24th before the House Intelligence Committee. I had asked that testimony be in public. They do not want to let me testify in public. I want it to be in public because a number of the members of that committee have maligned me in public. So, for example, when Congresswoman Spire, who's on the committee, says, and I quote, "Stone is on the Kremlin's payroll." No, I'm not. That's a lie. Apologize, or I will sue you. It's that simple. Now, I can't speak for what others have done, but I find it interesting that the 17 intelligence agencies that keep insisting there was Russian influence still can produce no smoking gun. Where is the proof? On January 20th, the New York Times wrote in a headline story that said, "Wiretap data utilized in probe of Trump aides," and they named 3 people, of which I am one, saying that the intelligence agencies now have emails, records of financial transactions, and transcripts of intercepted phone calls proving the Russian collusion. That was January. Where is this smoking gun? I don't believe it exists. I really don't. General General Flynn, while he may be guilty of stupidity, does not seem to be guilty of treason or collusion. I'm not sure that I would have taken a payment from Russian TV in honorarium. I'm not sure I would have lobbied for Turkey without filing everywhere we were supposed to opt. But neither one of those things constitute some effort of the Russians to tip the election. So I think it just kind of sputters out. Okay, I think we're there, yes?
Thank you. Legendary.